The university auditorium was buzzing with the kind of energy that comes from 100 students packed into one space. The air thick with the smell of cheap floor polish and nervous excitement. It was the annual Spring Talent Showcase, a night for guitar solos, dance crews, and dramatic poetry readings. Backstage was a controlled chaos of tuning instruments and whispered, last-minute rehearsals. She stood by a heavy black curtain, her fingers worrying the fabric. She hadn't planned on being here, not like this. Her friend, with a smile that was now more of a wince, had put her name on the sign-up sheet as a joke, then as a dare, and then somehow it wasn't a joke anymore. "It'll be fun," her friend had said, but now her friend was in the audience, and she was here, feeling like she might be sick. Her name was called over the scratchy loudspeaker, a sound that seemed to come from far away. Her stomach dropped. This was a mistake, a huge mistake. She was a music student, yes, but she was the one who buried herself in theory books and history essays. She practiced in lonely, soundproof rooms where no one could hear the fumbled notes. Performing was for other people, the ones with bright smiles and effortless confidence. She turned to the student running the show, an older boy with a headset and a clipboard. Panic made her voice thin. "There's been a mistake. I'm not really. I can't go out there." He looked up from his list, his eyes scanning her frightened face. He'd seen this look a dozen times tonight. He gave her a quick, sympathetic pat on the shoulder. "Hey, it's cool. No one expects a masterpiece. Just go out, play something super easy, and get off. Seriously. Chopsticks. Twinkle, twinkle. A basic scale anything. They'll clap to be nice, and we'll move on to the next act. No pressure." His words were meant to help, but they felt like a door slamming shut. Easy. It echoed in her head. Just play something easy and get off. It confirmed her worst fear, that she was a filler, a space between the real talents, someone whose only job was to not make a scene. The kindness in his advice felt worse than cruelty. Before she could protest again, the previous act, a loud, energetic band, finished with a crash of cymbals and whoops from the crowd. The boy with the headset gave her a gentle nudge toward the stage. "You're on. Just get it over with." The walk from the curtain to the piano in the center of the stage felt like the longest walk of her life. The stage lights were hot and blinding, turning the audience into a dark, shapeless sea of murmurs and shifting shadows. She could feel every single pair of eyes on her, a physical weight pushing down our shoulders. Her mouth was dry as dust. The grand piano was a beautiful, terrifying beast. She sat on the cool, hard bench, the leather creaking under her. The microphone in front of her hissed softly. She placed her hands in her lap, her fingers trembling. She could hear a few scattered coughs from the darkness, the rustle of someone opening a candy wrapper. They were waiting, but their patience was thin. They were waiting for her to be done. She looked down at the piano keys, a pattern of black and white that seemed to swim before her eyes. Play something easy. The instruction was a loop in her brain. Her right hand lifted, a single finger hovering over a middle C. She could play that note. She could play a few notes after it. A simple, childish tune. That's all they wanted. That's all she had to give. But as she stared, the polished black finish of the piano lid became a mirror. In its dark surface, she didn't see her own pale, scared face. She saw another room, much smaller, lit by a single lamp. She felt the familiar, worn fabric of an old sofa behind her. And she saw her grandmother's hands. They were elegant hands, even in old age, with long fingers that moved with a grace that seemed impossible. They would cover her own small, clumsy hands on the keys of a rickety, upright piano. "Listen," her grandmother would say in her soft, accented voice. "Don't just play the notes. You must tell the story." Her grandmother had been a pianist, a real one, in another country, another lifetime, before everything changed. before she had to leave her home and her dreams behind. The piano in their living room was her last connection to that life. The music she taught wasn't from beginner books. It was the music of her memory pieces, full of storm and longing, of deep forests and wide, empty skies. A memory, sharp and clear, cut through the panic. She was 12, struggling with a difficult passage, wanting to quit. Her grandmother had simply played it, her eyes closed. The room had filled with a sound so beautiful, and so sad it had made the young girl cry without knowing why. It wasn't just music. It was a feeling you could touch. On the stage, in the stifling silence, the organizer's voice in her head, "Play something easy," faded away. It was replaced by her grandmother's voice. "Tell the story." Her hands, which had been poised for a simple scale, shifted. Her left hand moved, not to a single key, but to form a rich, complex chord low on the piano. It was a sound like a deep, steady heartbeat. Her right hand lifted higher, not to gently tap, but to gather itself. She took a breath she didn't know she was holding, and let her fingers fall. The first notes that rang out into the quiet auditorium were not chopsticks. They were not easy. They were a deep, rolling wave of emotion, a melody that spoke of loss before a single word could be formed. It was the beginning of a piece her grandmother had played for her on rainy afternoons, a piece that held an entire history inside it. She had stopped playing for the audience in the dark. She had started playing for the woman in the reflection, and for the child she once was, listening in wonder. The story was beginning, and it was a true one. The first chord hung in the air, a deep, solemn sound that seemed to change the very quality of the silence in the room. It wasn't the bright, tinkling note everyone expected. This was something heavy and old, a sound that came from the belly of the piano and settled in the chests of the listeners. Her fingers, which had trembled just moments before, now moved with a sure and quiet strength. They knew this path. They had traveled it in a small, lamplit living room, guided by hands that were now only memory. The simple, childish tune she was supposed to play was gone, completely erased from her mind. In its place was a river of music, wide and deep and full of shadows. The piece began slowly, a questioning melody in the right hand over those steady, heartbeat chords in the left. It was the sound of someone walking alone, of looking back at a place they could never return to. She wasn't thinking about technique or performance. She wasn't thinking at all. Her eyes were open, but she didn't see the darkened auditorium. She saw her grandmother's face, the way her eyes would close when the music took hold, the small, sad smile that would touch her lips. She remembered the story that came with this piece. Her grandmother never told it directly, but she would speak in pieces as they practiced. "This part," she would say, her finger tracing the sheet music. "This is the wind in the pine trees near my home." Or, "Here, the melody is trying to remember a face it is starting to forget." The music was a map of a lost world. On stage, her body relaxed into the rhythm of that memory. The initial panic was gone, washed away by the tide of the song. Her shoulders, which had been tied up by her ears, dropped. Her breathing became slow and even matching the phrases of the music. Each note was no longer just a note. It was a word in a language only she and her grandmother had shared. A language of foggy mornings, of handwritten letters that took months to arrive, of a suitcase that always stayed packed in a corner, just in case. Down in the audience, the change was immediate. The polite, distracted energy of the crowd evaporated. A boy in the third row, who had been texting his friend about leaving early, slowly lowered his phone into his lap. He didn't look away from the stage. A girl farther back, who had been whispering a comment to her date, stopped mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open. The whisper died. The professor near the front, the one who taught music history, straightened in his seat. He knew this piece. He knew its technical difficulty, the emotional maturity it demanded. This was not a piece for a nervous sophomore in a campus talent show. This was concert hall material. Yet here it was, pouring from a student he might have passed in the hallway without a second glance. He listened, not as a critic, but as a man being told a secret. His analytical mind quieted, and he simply heard the sorrow. The music began to swell. The left hand's chords became more insistent, like a memory that wouldn't be ignored. The right hand's melody climbed higher, becoming sweeter, more painful. It was a love song to something vanished. In the back of the hall, an older woman, a staff member who had just come in to check on the event, felt her breath catch. She didn't know the name of the piece. She didn't need to. The sound went straight past her ears and into her heart, pulling up her own old grief. A parent gone, a childhood home sold. Without realizing it, a single tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't brush it away. On stage, the player was somewhere else entirely. The hot lights were just a warm sun from another time. The piano bench was her grandmother's worn sofa. She was playing the piece through to the end, just as she had promised she would one day. "You will play it for me when I cannot," her grandmother had said once casually, while dusting the piano. It had seemed a distant, impossible thing then, not now. She was keeping that promise. Her fingers flew over a rapid, intricate passage, notes falling like rain. There was no hesitation. It was as if her grandmother's hands were over hers again, guiding, pressing, lifting. The music wasn't perfect, a note was slightly blurred. A rhythm in a complex run was more felt than precise, but its imperfections made it more human, more true. It was felt, not just performed. A middle section arrived, quieter, more introspective. The storm of emotion calmed into a deep, aching loneliness. The melody became a single, fragile line, like a voice singing softly in an empty room. In the audience, complete stillness had taken hold. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. You could have heard a pin drop in the space between the piano's phrases. The collective breath of the room was held. They were no longer an audience watching a performance. They were witnesses to a soul speaking its truth. She leaned into the piano, her head bowing closer to the keys. This was the most vulnerable part, the confession within the story. Her own eyes were dry, but her face was a mask of deep concentration and reverence. She was not crying for her grandmother. She was speaking for her. She was using this language of black and white keys to say all the things that words had never been able to say. Thank you. I miss you. I remember. The final gentle notes of the section faded into a resonant silence. For a moment, there was only the faint echo in the hall and the soft sound of her own breath. Then her hands moved again, building slowly from that quiet place, beginning the journey toward the piece's powerful and heartbreaking conclusion. The story was not over. The deepest wave of feeling was still to come, and every person in that room was now journeying with her, waiting, feeling it build in their own hearts. They had forgotten where they were. They only knew they needed to hear how this story ended. The quiet did not last long, but it felt like a lifetime. From that place of deep, soft sadness, her hands began to move with a new kind of purpose. The music started to climb. It was slow at first, like someone gathering strength to stand after a long fall. The simple, lonely melody from the right hand began to weave itself into something more complex. Her left hand, which had been a steady, beating heart, now became a wave, rolling and building underneath. The notes grew louder, not in an angry way, but in a powerful, inevitable way, like a storm you see, coming from far across the water dot. She was no longer just remembering her grandmother's sitting room. She was inside the memory. The scent of old books and tea, the feel of a knitted shawl around her shoulders. As she listened, the sight of her grandmother's profile against the window, All of it was more real than the stage lights. Her fingers were not just playing notes written by some old composer. They were digging into the earth of her own history. They were pulling up roots in stories and handing them to the dark room dot in the audience. People were leaning forward. They were not thinking about the time, or their phones, or the next act. They were being pulled into the story the music was telling. A young man in a baseball cap found himself thinking of his grandfather's hands, rough from work, teaching him how to tie a fishing knot. A woman, sitting alone, felt a sudden, sharp memory of a childhood friend she had lost touch with years ago. The music was a key, and it was unlocking private rooms in everyone's heart. The music built and built. Her body began to move with it, not in big, showy motions, but with a natural force. She leaned into the heavy, booming chords in the bass, her shoulder dipping down. Then she would lift, her right hand flying up to the high notes, which rang out like clear, sad bells. The piece was a battle between despair and a fierce, stubborn love. You could hear the love winning, but it was a painful victory. The professor in the front row had taken off his glasses. He was just listening, his hand over his mouth. He had heard professionals play this piece with flawless technique, but he had never heard it played like this. This wasn't about being perfect. This was about being true. The student on stage was giving a piece of herself away, and the raw honesty of it was almost too much to bear. He felt a tightness in his own throat. And came the climax. It was a torrent of sound, a cascade of notes that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her fingers were a blur, but every note had its place. Every chord landed with a weight that shook the air. It was the sound of a heart breaking wide open. It was grief, loud and roaring and beautiful all at once. It wasn't a quiet, polite sadness. It was the full, messy, overwhelming reality of missing someone forever in that roaring flood of music. Something let go. On stage, her careful control slipped for just a second. Not in her hands, they flew on, sure and strong, but in her face. A single shining tear escaped from her closed eyes. It traced a quick path down her cheek, catching the light for a moment before falling, unseen by her, onto the moving keys below. She did not sob. She did not falter. She simply let the tear fall, a part of the music now. The woman in the back saw it. The tear was a small thing, but in the middle of that huge sound, it was enormous. It was the final human clue that broke the spell for everyone, in the best way. It was the proof that this was real. That's when the first quiet sob was heard in the audience. It came from somewhere in the middle. Then another, a stifled gasp from the side. A man in a work jacket quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Looking straight ahead, the wave of sound began to recede. The storm was passing. The powerful chord softened, broke apart, and became that single searching melody again. But it was changed now. It was tired, but it was at peace. The fight was over. What was left was memory, tender and sharp and sweet. Her playing became gentle, a lullaby. The final minute of the piece was a slow letting go. The melody echoed itself, growing quieter each time, like footsteps walking away down a long, empty hallway. The notes were so soft now that the audience had to hold its breath to hear them. The last few chords were spaced apart, hanging in the quiet air. They were questions that didn't need answers. And then it was over. Her hands lifted from the keys and settled back into her lap, palms down. The last note vibrated in the body of the great piano, a ghost of the sound, and then it too faded into nothing. Complete, total silence. It was a different silence than before. Before, it had been an empty silence, waiting to be filled. This silence was full. It was heavy with everything that had just been poured into it. It was a respectful, almost holy quiet. No one clapped. No one moved. It felt wrong to break the spell with something as ordinary as applause. She sat perfectly still on the bench, her head bowed, looking at her hands. She was back in the auditorium now. The memory had released her. She felt empty, but a clean empty, like a room after a deep cleaning. She was also suddenly aware of the hundreds of people sitting in the dark. A chill of fear tried to return. Asterisk, what have I done? She thought. Asterisk, I didn't play something easy. I played my whole heart. Asterisk, she braced herself for the polite, confused clapping, the sound of people shifting, ready to move on. She prepared for the awkward walk off the stage under the bright, hot lights. But the silence held. For 3 seconds, 4, 5 dot in the darkness, a person stood up. It was the professor. He wasn't clapping. He was just standing, his hands at his sides, looking at the young woman at the piano. It was a gesture of respect. Then, next to him, another person rose. Then another. It was like a wave moving slowly through the room. There was no sound but the rustle of clothing, the scrape of chairs. They were all standing. Every single person in the auditorium was on their feet. They were giving her the only thing that felt right after a gift like that, their complete and silent attention. The air itself seemed to hum. She looked up finally and saw them. A sea of shadowy figures, all standing in the dark. Not clapping, just standing, witnessing, and that's when she understood. She hadn't just played a piece. She had told a story, and they had all listened. Truly listened. And in the quiet that followed, she knew her grandmother had heard it too. The standing silence felt like it stretched on for an hour, but it was only a handful of seconds. In that quiet, the young woman at the piano simply existed. The roar of the music was still echoing inside her, and the sight of all those people standing in the dark, not clapping, just seeing her, was almost too much to understand. Then, it broke. It started with one pair of hands coming together in the front. A slow, solid clap. Then another joined. And another. It wasn't the loud, wild cheering from the band earlier. This was different. It was a deep, thunderous, rolling sound of respect. It filled the room like a heartbeat, steady and strong. People were still standing, but now they were clapping, their faces serious, many still wiping at their eyes. The sound jolted her back into her body. She blinked, looking out at the blur of faces now coming into focus under the dim house lights that had been turned up. She didn't know what to do. Her instinct was to run, to get off the stage as quickly as possible. But something held her there, a feeling of duty. She had given them something, and this applause was their gift back. It would be rude not to accept it. Slowly, awkwardly, she pushed the piano bench back and stood up. Her legs felt like water. She took one small, hesitant step toward the front of the stage. She gave a little bow, just a quick dip of her head and shoulders, and immediately turned to leave. The applause swelled louder. It pushed against her back. It wasn't letting her go. She turned back, confused. People weren't stopping. They were clapping harder. Some were even whistling. The professor in the front was nodding at her, a small, sure smile on his face, his hands still coming together in that steady, meaningful rhythm. She had to do something. So she bowed again, a little deeper this time. She tried to smile, but it felt wobbly and strange on her face. She waved a small, shy wave with one hand. This only made the applause grow warmer, friendlier. They weren't just clapping for the music anymore. They were clapping for her, for the scared student who had disappeared, and the brave soul who had taken her place. Finally, she managed to walk off the stage. The moment she stepped into the wings, the boy with the headset was there. His clipboard was hanging at his side, forgotten. His mouth was open. He looked at her like he had never seen her before. "Whoa," was all he could say. Then he shook his head as if clearing it. "I mean, that was. I have no words, really." She just nodded, unable to speak. Her friend from the audience burst through the curtain, her eyes wide and shiny with tears. She didn't say anything either. She just threw her arms around her and hugged her tight, squeezing the air out of her. The hug said everything. Asterisk, I'm sorry. I'm proud. I had no idea. Asterisk, back on stage. The next act was being announced, but the feeling in the room had changed. The clapping for the next performer was polite, but it was normal clapping. The magic spell was over. People were still buzzing, leaning over to whisper to each other, glancing back toward the wings where she had disappeared. For her, the rest of the night was a blur of quiet moments and hushed voices. She sat on a dusty speaker case backstage, her hands still trembling slightly. A few other performers came up to her. A guitarist touched her shoulder and said, "Man, that wrecked me." In a good way. A girl from the dance group just squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you." When she finally gathered the courage to walk out into the lobby, things got stranger. People she had never seen before looked at her, then did a double take. An older couple, probably parents of another performer, stopped her. The woman's eyes were red-rimmed. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice thick. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. You? You took me somewhere else. Thank you." The woman reached out and gently patted her arm before walking away. Leaning on her husband, she felt like she was floating. The praise was overwhelming, almost embarrassing. Part of her wanted to hide, to explain it away. "It was my grandmother, not me," she wanted to say. But she just nodded and whispered, "Thank you for listening." The professor found her near the water fountain. He didn't give her a big speech. He just said, "You know, we have a master class next month with a visiting pianist. You should play for her. That piece." Just like that. He handed her a crisp white business card. "Email me. We'll make it happen." Then he gave her a knowing look and melted back into the crowd. The walk back to her dorm room that night was quiet. The spring air was cool on her face. She could still feel the weight of the piano keys under her fingers, the echo of the final chord in her ears. But the loudest sound was the memory of that silence, the full, heavy silence before the applause. It was a silence that felt like being seen, truly seen, for the first time. She unlocked her door to her dark, quiet room. She dropped her bag and walked over to her desk. On it, in a simple wooden frame, was a photograph of her grandmother, taken years ago, sitting at that old upright piano in the living room. Caught in a moment of laughter, she picked up the frame. She looked into the smiling eyes in the photo. "I did it?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking just a little. "I told your story." And they all listened. She put the frame back down, her heart full and aching in the best way. She wasn't just the shy girl in the back of the class anymore. She was the girl who carried a world of sound inside her, and tonight, for a few minutes, she had let it out. And the world, in its own way, had sung back. The week that followed the talent show felt strange, like walking around in a world that had slightly shifted its colors. Word traveled, as it does on a college campus. People in her music theory class would glance her way, offering shy smiles. The boy who ran the soundboard for the show gave her a thumbs up from across the dining hall. It was a quiet kind of fame, built on a feeling everyone had shared, but it still felt heavy on her shoulders. She worried it had been a one-time thing, a lightning strike of emotion she could never repeat. But the professor's business card sat on her desk, a small white rectangle of possibility. She stared at it for 3 days before she finally wrote the email. It was short, just a few lines saying she was interested in the masterclass. He wrote back immediately, with a time and a room number. "Just play what you played," the email ended. "That is more than enough." The day of the masterclass arrived. The room was not a large auditorium, but a smaller recital hall with good acoustics. The visiting pianist was a woman with a kind face and sharp, observant eyes. A handful of other advanced students were there to play, too. The atmosphere was serious, studious. This was about technique, about critique, about learning. When it was her turn, the old fear tried to crawl back into her throat. This was different. These were experts. They would hear every missed nuance, every imperfection she had poured her heart into. She sat at the piano, the same grand piano from the showcase, and her fingers felt stiff. She looked at the visiting pianist, who nodded encouragingly. "Begin when you're ready," the woman said. She closed her eyes. She could not see the dark, shapeless audience this time. She could only see the bright, professional room. The memory of her grandmother's living room felt distant, a story she had told once, but couldn't quite remember the words to. She started to play. The notes were correct. The technique was there, maybe even cleaner than before. But after about a minute, the visiting pianist raised a gentle hand. "Stop, please." The room was quiet. The other students watched. The professor looked on, his face neutral. The visiting pianist leaned forward. "You play the notes beautifully. The fingering on that difficult passage is very good." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But you are holding back. You are playing the memory of the emotion, not the emotion itself. Where is the storm? Where is the heartbreak?" The words landed like stones. She felt her face grow warm. She had been found out. The magic had been a fluke. She started, but had no explanation. "Tell me," the pianist said, her voice softer now. "Why this piece? What does it mean to you?" The question hung in the air. She looked down at the keys. The polished black surface showed her own worried reflection. She had to look past it. She had to look through it. She took a slow breath. "It was my grandmother's," she said, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. "She taught it to me. She couldn't bring her piano when she had to leave her home. So she brought the music in here. She tapped her chest. And she put it in here. She touched her temple. She gave it to me. That night at the showcase, I wasn't playing for anyone. I was playing for her. I was keeping a promise." The room was utterly still. The visiting pianist's expression changed. The sharp, analytical look melted into one of deep understanding. She nodded slowly. "A promise," the woman repeated. "Then play it for her again. Right now. We are not here. This room is not here. Play it for the woman who gave it to you. The technique is in your hands. The story is in your heart. Trust it." The pianist sat back. The instruction was clear. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being true. She placed her hands back on the keys. This time, she didn't try to perform. She didn't try to remember how it felt that night. She simply thought of her grandmother's voice. Not teaching, but speaking. Telling her about the smell of the air in the mountains back home. About the way the light came through the window of her first piano teacher's studio. She thought of the weight of her grandmother's hand on her shoulder. A silent thank you after she finally played the piece through, without stopping as a teenager. And then she began again. It was different from the very first chord. It wasn't louder, but it was fuller. It was alive. The storm built, not because the sheet music said to get louder, but because the memory of loss demanded it. The quiet middle section wasn't just soft. It was intimate, a private conversation happening right there in the room. She wasn't crying, but her whole body spoke the language of the music leaning into the grief, lifting with the fragile hope. When she finished, The silence in the recital hall was a professional silence, but it was a warm one. The other students were watching her, not with jealousy, but with a kind of awe. They had just seen the difference between playing notes and making music. The visiting pianist was smiling. "There," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Now I heard it. Now I heard her. That is musicianship. That is the real work. Never lose that connection. The technique." She waved a hand. "The technique serves that. Never the other way around." After the class, as she was packing her music, the professor came over. "You see?" he said. "It wasn't an accident. It's a gift. And it's a responsibility." Walking back to her dorm, she finally understood. The standing ovation, the tears, the stunned silence that hadn't been the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The real journey wasn't about repeating one perfect night. It was about learning how to find that honest place on command, to channel that memory and love through discipline and craft. It was about honoring the gift by working hard enough to be worthy of it. That night, she sat at the small keyboard in her dorm room. She placed the photograph of her grandmother on the music stand. She practiced scales first, slowly, carefully. Then she worked on a difficult section of another piece, focusing on the tricky fingering. And then, finally, she played her grandmother's piece again. Not with the full force of emotion, but with attention. She worked on a transition, smoothed out a run. It was a practice session, ordinary and unmagical. But as she played the final, familiar chord, she looked at the photograph. She knew now that the promise wasn't just to play the piece once in a blaze of feeling. The promise was to carry it forward, to tend to it, to let it live through her hands for as long as she could. It was a lifelong conversation, one she had just learned how to truly begin. The music had ended, but the story, her story, was just getting started. And for the first time, that thought didn't scare her. It filled her with a quiet, steady purpose.